Hey everyone, I am Tiffany and I'm very excited to be emceeing this next upcoming session with Michelle Schulp. She's going to be telling us all about design with Gutenberg, which is exciting for me. So hopefully there's something that you all are getting out of that as well. Just a little bit about Michelle before I turn it over to her. She is a independent graphic designer and front-end developer in Minneapolis and has been collaborating on projects with clients from solopreneurs to enterprise and really focused on solving like the tangible problems and achieving real goals like based on how people think. And I think this is going to be a real treat for us. So, Michelle, the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Hi, everybody out there in virtual land. Hope you're having a really good WordCamp. I have no way of knowing because I'm just staring at a camera looking at you, but I'm going to assume, because you can't tell me no, that the answer is yes. Anyway, welcome to Atomic Design with Gutenberg. I'm going to go over a whole bunch of things. That was a really great introduction. Normally, this is the part of the talk where I talk a little bit about myself. There isn't really much else you need to know. I do design as well as building front-end interfaces, especially for WordPress. I also do work with Target and some other enterprise clients, and I'm a SiteGround ambassador. So if you want to ask me questions about any of those things in the chat anytime after this, feel free. I usually ask during this point what all of you are, what all your backgrounds are. I know that in many other talks in the past, I have a mix of people, designers, developers, content managers, and usually there's a lot of different diverse backgrounds. So I'm going to try to speak to all of those different people while I'm giving this talk. But before I dive into Gutenberg and block editing and all of that stuff, I want to go into a little bit of a brief history of how we got here in the first place. So where have we come from that we've ended up in this point on the web? Now, before the web, there were these things called pages, and a lot of them were printed on dead trees. I know it's weird, but it's a thing. Books, magazines, literature, these were all pages. And what was unique about pages is that they were non-changing, right? Like you wrote something on a page, you printed something out, it existed in perpetuity until that page didn't exist anymore. When the web was created, it was formatted as pages in order to kind of fit the same mold. Like we understood what a page was, we've been reading books for a while, and now static HTML is pages, right? But then after static HTML, we were like, hey, we want to do stuff that's a little bit more dynamic. And so we started building websites from databases and templates. And this might start to sound familiar because WordPress is one of these things, right? It is something that is managing content through templates and databases. And what does that mean? It means that the information's not static. It's a little bit more interesting. Content can update, it can influence other content, it can be connected in a whole bunch of new and exciting ways. So this became much more fun than just static HTML templates. We could do a lot of interesting stuff. So at this point, what were people talking about? Stuff in WordPress like themes and plugins and metadata. We're talking about relationships like one-to-one relationships, one-to-many relationships. These are all these different really cool, fun things that became possible as we got into content management. And as we were talking about all of these things, we realized that we were limited a little bit by this page model. We're still trying to think about pages, but we're trying to do all of these interesting and unique things with content, which is no longer static anymore, right? Content is dynamic and interactive. And we want to do more than just display non-changing content to people, right? What does WordPress have even? We have archives, we have users, we have all these different things in databases. We can filter things, we can interact with things, submit forms. We built, entire e-commerce platforms, calendars. We've built so many different things, and yet we're still thinking about pages, and there's like a big stressor there, right? One thing that you learn as you're starting to analyze content on pages is that the unique content is smaller than the page itself, right? Elements on a page can be reused in multiple places and in different contexts. Another thing that you learn is that how it works is not dependent on what it says. What I mean by that is similar functional elements can be used to display different types of content. So, for example, a card, like something in Pinterest, or a call to action, right? You can use a card and it can have a whole bunch of different types of content. A call to action can be used in a lot of different ways, right? So how it works is not dependent on what it says. We also are believing that experiences on the web, your experience, my experience, should be customizable to who we are and what we're trying to do, right? Outside of just the content, whole entire experiences could be customizable, right? Imagine if I go to a website and the layout or the header and footer, the things that are interactive, are different based on me going versus you going. Different contextual information, different personalization. Now, we do know this can get a little bit creepy when it comes to looking up something one time and then suddenly every single ad across every single social network is about that thing. But it is also useful, like, for example, when we're looking for results on Google and it knows to return local results a little bit sooner than national results if we're looking for a place, right? So personalization, customization is a very useful thing when it comes to stuff. But that's being pushed back against when we're talking about page layouts, right? So now what are we talking about? You know, we've gone beyond just talking about themes and plugins. We're talking about patterns. We're talking about systems. A lot of things on the web we're talking about, we need to be able to maintain these things, right? It's constantly growing and evolving. How do we scale these things to something bigger? How do we grow? How do we move fast? How do we prototype? How do we iterate, right? So this is what we're trying to figure out as we move forward beyond the page model. There was a concept in 2013 called atomic design that was come up with by a person named Brad Frost. He wrote a blog post about it, and eventually it's turned into a book. It's turned into a whole entire demo. But basically, this concept called atomic design, the base idea behind that is that elements are modular, right? Pages are modular, websites are modular, content is modular. The web is made out of unique, reorderable, reusable elements that can be combined in different ways to build content structures. So that's important, reorderable and reusable elements. Another principle is that content should dictate your layout rather than layout dictating your content. So what is on the page will determine how the information is presented rather than needing to shoehorn the information you're presenting into the way the page is supposed to be laid out, right? Also, all of these elements on the page are each self-contained elements. So that means they can exist anywhere they're needed. They can exist within multiple contexts. They can exist within multiple locations. Like we talked about before with the card. A card can be here or it could be over here. It's still a card. And because the entire site functions as a system, all of the elements should blend seamlessly into the site. So they should all feel like they fit. Both functionality and appearance should feel cohesive. So no matter where you see an element on the site, it should feel like it belongs there and make sense. So what does all of this look like from a structural perspective? How would we structure a modular atomic site? Usually I would ask everybody who's heard of the single-use principle. This is used a lot in development. It basically means that each thing that you do should do one thing and do it well. This is combined with DRY, which stands for don't repeat yourself, which means if you can abstract something into something reusable, do so, right? You don't want to be rewriting the same code. If you're going to use something more than once, don't repeat yourself. Make a reusable component and then do it a bunch of places. This also means that we would be using a modular file structure. So this is using content templates and template parts. We would be organizing our CSS styles into different compartments by specificity and type. So all of the different file structures are very modular. They're very reusable. It's very easy to tell what goes with what. There are a few related concepts in the design and development world that you may have heard of that kind of go along with this whole modular atomic design thing, and I'm going to go over a few of them. One of them is a concept called component libraries, as you can see in the visual. These are usually pre-built elements that can be reused across a site or an app. If any of you have worked with a framework like Bootstrap, this is very similar to that, right? That's a component library. It comes with a whole bunch of buttons and inputs and different interactive elements and different icons. But what a component library is, it's just a set of tools, right? It's just a set of stuff that already exists, but there aren't really necessarily any design or brand guidelines on where or when you're supposed to use them, right? Now we have something called style guides also, which is basically a set of instructions for why and how to use different how to use different visual elements, right? But it isn't necessarily a library of those elements, right? So style guides you see a lot in brand documentation where it's like, this is how you use typography. This is how you should place the logo. This is what you should do with images. But it doesn't necessarily contain actual files to use. Then we also have design systems. Now, design systems are kind of like a hybrid between those two things. So you usually have a collection of components, and those are all unified under a consistent set of standards. So that means you've got all of your different specific web components to pull into, but you've also got, here are the color palettes, here's how you use each heading, here is how you use imagery, and here are the actual physical components. And atomic design is basically a way of building a web design system that is very, very modular. And this is just like chemistry. And I know that we all completely remember our chemistry from high school, so this is going to be really easy for everybody. But basically, we are going from the least complex to the most complex. We're starting from the smallest and going to the largest, and we're going from very, very general rules to very, very specific rules. So what do I mean by that? This is a great example that I saw of going from an atom to a molecule to an organism to a template and then to a page. I will go over all of these in detail, but I really liked this animation that I found because it really shows how everything kind of combines. So I'll just let that play through a couple times so you can see it. There's a template, there's a page. Sweet. All right, let's talk about all of these things in detail. We're going to start with atoms. Now, again, if you remember from chemistry, atoms are the smallest unique building blocks of elements, right? Now, if you're a big geek like I am, you know that there are smaller things than atoms, but atoms are the smallest recognizable bits of an element. What is that in web terminology? Web atoms are your HTML elements, right? So that's things like colors, typography, utilities, all of that stuff. Somebody even made a periodic table of HTML elements, which I think is fantastic. There's a link to that. And don't worry, there will be a link to these slides at the end, so you'll be able to find everything. Don't panic. But basically, these are all of your block level HTML elements, right? Those are your atoms. What does that look like here? Here's a great example of some of those things: an image, headings, a button, but also things like your colors or other different small utility classes, inputs, right? What you see here is that you can tell what these are, but this is not a website, right? This is just a collection of stuff. Just like a whole bunch of atoms doesn't really do anything. It's just, stuff. So then what happens? Well, remember chemistry, if you combine a bunch of atoms together, you get molecules, right? And so in atomic design, you are combining a bunch of HTML elements together in specific useful ways. These are unique, repeatable combinations of atoms. What does that look like? This could be something like an image with a caption, or a image locked up with some text, or maybe it's a definition list, or a form, or breadcrumbs, or a navigation item, or a title with a link embedded in it, right? So these, you're noticing, are starting to look like useful things, but we're still not seeing a web page here, right? These are still just bigger collections of stuff, bigger, slightly more useful collections of stuff, right? Now, biologists are probably going to argue with me a little bit here, but when you combine a bunch of molecules together, you get organisms, right? And organisms, as you know, are alive, right? They do stuff. So I like to say that organisms in atomic design are molecules coming together that allow some kind of action. We're starting to probably recognize these as block level elements, which we'll see in Gutenberg. But these are repeatable combinations of molecules. They are more complex. Obviously, an organism is more complex than a molecule. And these are usually like single contained units of content. So what are some good examples of that? You can see here maybe an entire contact form, right, which is comprised of several different molecules of different inputs, and those molecules are comprised of different atoms, like a label and an input. And then there's also a button. Maybe a header is a great example of an organism because you've got your logo, your navigation, and a search bar. Maybe a grid with some captions, or this big hero feature image, right? So these are a bunch of really great examples of organisms. And then we have templates. And now, as WordPress people, we've heard the word template before, right? We know what that is. But in atomic design, a template is when you're starting to combine all of these block level elements together in different ways that are repeatable to create layouts, right? Again, we're talking about repeatability. We're taking organisms, putting them together, and making templates. These are full layouts and also just whole content stories. What's an example of that? So you can see here, you probably recognize some of these elements from the previous pages, but we've put some organisms together to be able to create some templates. I'm going to go back to the organism example right now, so you can see these grids here, this hero image, this big header, right? And now we've got these templates. You can recognize some of that stuff, the big hero image, the grid, these lists, right? So now we are taking organisms and we're building templates. The chemistry, biology models kind of broken down a little bit, but that's all right. We'll forgive them and move on. Now we've got pages, and pages are templates with specific content. And I know that we as WordPress people definitely identify with this because we have built lots and lots of pages out of templates before, but basically the same template with different content are different pages. What's a great example of that? Well, here is the template right here, and here is that template filled with content on the right side, right? So you can see pretty much the same thing from an old project that I did. Here is an example of the same template, but with two different kinds of content, different colors, different styles, same template, right? So we all understand this. This is where I'd be checking in. Does everybody understand, atomic design? I'll be able to take some questions about that at the end if we have any now, since it's digital. I'm going to move on, though, because my talk was about Gutenberg, right? And I haven't said anything about Gutenberg yet. Gutenberg, for those of you that don't necessarily know, is the name of the experimental development plugin that is feeding features into what is now known as the WordPress Block Editor, which is part of Core since WordPress 5.0. So it was going by the name of Gutenberg before it was merged into Core, and the plugin that is still developing features for the block editor is still known as Gutenberg. Gutenberg being the inventor of the printing press. It's very clever. Good job, geeks. Way to name things. The point of Gutenberg, and when we adopted Gutenberg into Core, we were moving away from the content blob, which is basically when we were dumping content into the content editor. That was the blob, right? And we are moving from the blob to blocks, which is adding structure to this content, right? This is the first iteration of the block editor, is changing the structure of the content, specifically the WordPress function, the content. From developer.wordpress.org, I really liked this quote. It gets to the heart of things. At the core of Gutenberg lies the concept of the block. From a technical point of view, blocks both raise the level of abstraction from a single document to a collection of meaningful elements, and they replace ambiguity inherent in HTML with explicit structure. So again, we're talking about collections of elements. We're talking about structure. From a user perspective, blocks allow any kind of content, media, or functionality to be directly added to their site in a more consistent and usable way. The Add Block button gives the user access to an entire library of options all in one place. That sounds great. So in other words, what are we talking about when we're talking about Gutenberg? We're talking about reorderable, reusable elements that combine to build unique content. That sounds very familiar, right? We're talking about letting our content dictate our layout rather than our layout dictating our content. Doesn't that sound, I mean, that kind of rings a bell. I feel like we've heard that before. So what is the structure of a Gutenberg site? What does that look like for WordPress? Well, much like WordPress overall, Core supplies a basic collection of blocks, and then plugins can expand on top of that. So WordPress comes with certain blocks already pre-installed, baked into it since 5.0, since it's merged in, and it's adding more all the time if you follow the Gutenberg plugin. And then other plugins can add additional blocks on top of that. Blocks are kind of interesting from a design perspective. They provide a hybrid of the overall visuals being controlled by the theme designs and also individual options within the block to fit the context the user needs. So what I mean by that is you might load up some blocks and they're going to pull in, the way that your headings, the colors, the way that your text is styled and the rest of your theme, but they might have some options to override that. So you could pick maybe this specific block should be aligned left, this specific block should have this color, this specific block should be treated this way. So we're combining basically the thoughtful consideration by the theme developer with specific overrides by the user. Here's an extreme example of that. So, a little while ago, I was playing with the button block And so you can see that the center align button in the middle was the default button style that my theme does, and then I was able to override that with some very specific styles using the options for that block. So there's an interesting combination of things going on here. So if you look right now at the various core Gutenberg blocks as they exist right now, you can see examples of all different kinds of atomic elements. We're relating this back to atomic design, right? For example, for your atoms, we have the headings, we have paragraphs, links, we have separators, we have buttons, we have colors. All of these things are currently existing as blocks in Gutenberg, right? So if you just start typing paragraph blocks, you're using atoms right now. And there's plenty of color options and stuff. All of these things are atoms. You can also see molecules. So what are molecules in Gutenberg? Ordered and unordered lists are molecules. That's because you have the main unordered or ordered list element with each of the individual list elements inside it. Tables with headers and footers are a great example of a molecule because you've got your headings, your rows, your individual cells. A quote plus a citation is a good example of a molecule. Image plus captions. All of these things are built into Gutenberg and the block editor right now. Additional examples of molecules. Again, you've got maybe like a video or an audio block, right? These are great examples here. Navigation is a great example. This is something that I believe is still in the Gutenberg plugin. It's not in core yet. I don't remember. I have the plugin enabled on a lot of my sites, so it's hard for me to remember like which things have been merged in versus which are still in the plugin, but navigation is a great example of a molecule that you can access. Then you have organisms, so some more complex ones. If you've played with the gallery block in Gutenberg, or in block editor, that is a great example of an organism because you have several different images which can have captions, which can have links, which can go to a whole bunch of different things, which have all of these settings for different columns, for different croppings. The media and text block is a great example. That's the one that has an image with text set next to it as one block. That's a great organism. One you've probably played with is the cover block, right? Because you've got your background image and overlay colors, and you can put a whole bunch of stuff in it. You can put buttons inside it. Groups and columns are also a great example of organisms because it's, again, a bigger structure that is holding a bunch of other elements inside it. And if you've installed any kind of custom blocks, any kind of dynamic blocks, so blocks that are maybe pulling in posts from other parts of your site, or any of the reusable blocks, or these custom blocks, these are some of the blocks that I've installed on some client sites. A lot of these are organisms because they have a lot of different molecules and atoms working together. And then we have templates. So how do we interact with templates? So WordPress obviously still has standard page templates that we're used to working with. It has these standard WordPress templates that are part of the the template hierarchy, our post templates and our archive templates, our taxonomy templates, etc. The custom page templates we're used to working with. But there's also post type block templates. This is an example from the events calendar. So when you install that one and you go to add an event, it actually is automatically populated with these blocks so that you can see a title and a bunch of other things. You can also move them around, remove them, add other blocks in between, but it's basically a shell of blocks that exists for you to start building a template. All right, so that's where we're at now with the core block editor and with Gutenberg, but there are a lot of things coming up in the future. Editing the content is just the beginning. And if you've installed the Gutenberg plugin, you can see a lot of these future-facing things, and a lot of them are getting more and more stable as things go on. So I want to go a little bit into, and I use this rocket ship. I didn't even realize that the theme was going to be space, so that works out. But what is the future of block editing? First of all, we have block patterns, and this is something that exists in the Gutenberg plugin right now. But basically, a pattern is another organism, right? It's a collection of several blocks together. For example, in this one, 2 images side by side. It's something we're probably going to see a whole bunch. If you wanted to do it manually, you might have to do 2 columns and then put images in them. This is just there; it already exists for you. A hero with 2 columns, right? Again, this is something you can build manually, or it can be saved as a pattern. There's a little bit more information about patterns there. We can talk about it later if you want to. We also have block templates. So this is something that is going to be part of the WordPress hierarchy. There's going to be, or they've been talking about a block templates folder. So if you're doing custom theme development as opposed to just putting content together as an implementer, this is something to keep an eye on as a theme developer, as a plugin developer. Much like how normal WordPress templates can include template parts. So again, to make it reusable, if we're going to be including a certain kind of way of displaying content multiple times, we usually abstract that into a template part so we can call it in multiple places. Blocks will be able to do the same thing. They will be able to have template parts. Those can be reused in multiple places, which will be very useful if you're putting together, say, a suite of blocks and there are reusable components within all of those blocks. So something to keep an eye on if you are a theme or plugin developer that wants to do custom block development. There's also this thing called Gutenberg Experiments. So if you have the Gutenberg plugin installed and you go to the experiments settings, you can enable some of these things. These are all, this is the most recent one that I just got a few days ago. But the most interesting one that a lot of people are talking about is this full site editing thing, right? And that's the next step, right? Remember how I talked about currently the core block editor is only editing the content, that area that used to be controlled by the tiny MCE text editor. Now we're talking about, the entire site, right, should be customizable, right? It's not just the part that's in the content. Like, what about the headers and footers? What about the sidebars? What about everything else? So this is where the whole site editor is getting a lot of attention right now. This is an older version of it. I haven't gone back in and checked on it in the latest iteration. But we are talking about basically making your entire site editable via the block editor. Headers, footers, everything. And so the big question that comes up when we're starting to talk about this, like, it sounds cool, but then I'm a theme developer, right? Like, that is what I do. So what am I even doing, right? What is a theme in the age of blocks? Where are we going from here if we are a theme developer? I actually believe that themes are going to have a very powerful role in the age of blocks because themes are what is going to provide the visual story and the personality, right? There is a concept in WordPress called decisions, not options. And I believe, and that basically means that if you're presented with a billion different options for something, it's almost impossible to pick something. If it is a curated set of decisions, you'll be able to actually move forward and make a choice. And I believe it will be the theme author's job to take all of this potential that the block editor has and turn it into a set of curated and thoughtful decisions that the theme author provides to the user, and the user can then take and build their custom thing, right? So I believe that themes will be very responsible for providing extremely good styling for core blocks and content. I believe that they will be curating all of those block editor options. So there are definitely ways right now to be able to say, no, you can't pick every single color in the rainbow, but you can definitely pick from all of your brand colors that we've already pre-set up for you. No, you can't pick every single typography size available, but you can pick from these predetermined ones that are in your style guide, right? No, your theme doesn't make any sense with supporting the wide width blocks. So there's lots of block editor options that already exist that the theme author can curate for the end user. I also believe that themes are going to be differentiating themselves by including different kind of block patterns and templates within their theme. So the blocks themselves are contained within core or plugins, so they can exist across multiple themes. But what the theme can do is provide specific block templates for page layouts or for full site layouts, right? So I could install the theme and I could just have a whole bunch of different patterns already available, right? They won't go away if I change themes because they're all still blocks and the blocks exist everywhere. But what I did do as a theme person is I'm like, well, I know that this theme is specifically serving this audience. So I'm going to put together all of these different patterns that they already have available. I also believe that themes will be able to differentiate themselves by providing detailed styling for very specific plugins. For example, like they do now, they could be a theme that explicitly supports, I'm a WooCommerce theme, right? So I have not only thought about all of the core content, all of the core styling, but I'm styling for everything that WooCommerce could also provide. And it looks like it blends in, right? Or I'm an events theme, so I am definitely supporting these events plugins. Not only did I style for everything, but I have also really thoughtfully considered all the stuff that plugin is going to be adding, right? I believe that's going to be a way that themes will still differentiate themselves. They'll also be able to support specific recommended block libraries. So there's already a bunch of libraries out there like CoBlocks or Atomic Blocks, ACF blocks, or if you as a theme person provide your own block plugin with extra options or visuals, your theme will provide special stylized support for that. Now, again, that doesn't mean that your theme is only styling for those blocks. If you're following Atomic design, you will be styling for any kind of content in a fairly thoughtful way, but you'll be explicitly styling for these recommended blocks or these recommended plugins. All right. So I get a few questions about how you design atomically, right? Like, how do you think about this? This is very strange. It's very different than design school where they have you think about the end product. We're basically thinking about an end product that doesn't actually exist. At this time, we're thinking about any number of end products. So what do you do as a designer designing with Atomic design? A big pushback is that design systems can become very boring and redundant, right? Like, how are we supposed to be exciting if we're trying to standardize everything? I don't believe that we are trying to turn design into something that's robotic or boring. I actually believe that design is most successful when it's happening within a very specific framework, right? So what we're trying to do is enable that creativity while still enabling consistency. How do we do that? Again, we are thinking about building systems rather than pages. So we're basically building the style guide, we're building the component library, we're building something that is considered, it's well thought out, it makes a lot of sense. We're not building a home page and a landing page and an about page, right? So that's something to be thinking about. To start with, if you're redesigning a site or creating something new, audit what you have or brainstorm what you're going to have and figure out what all of these repeatable elements and chunks of content or functionality are. Again, we're trying to identify all of these different components. What are the organisms we're going to have? What are the molecules we're going to have? What are the blocks we're going to have? Similar to the things you'd find in a component library. You want to identify all of your branded design elements, stuff like what are my colors, what are my fonts, what is the visual storytelling language, how am I using spacing, etc. So this is similar to what would go in a style guide. These are your visual atoms. Then you want to define what your molecules and organisms are, right? The bigger things, calls to actions, cards, heroes, lists, grids, all of that stuff. What are all of these different blocks that are going to exist? And then if we're building this in WordPress, we want to map out all of these blocks to what are things that we could build using core blocks, right? What can we build building patterns out of core blocks? What can we build out of columns and groups and images and stuff? And then what do we need a custom block for? What isn't there a solution for already, right? And then map that out so we know, like, what is WordPress already supporting and what do we need to find a solution for? And then make a plan for the block options, right? So if you're supporting WordPress core blocks, are we going to be overriding the color palette that WordPress provides with our very specific colors? Are we going to be overriding the size of typography, any other options? Are you supporting custom widths? If you're building custom blocks and they have very specific backgrounds or stuff, what happens if those are rearranged on the page? You know, take account of those things as you're doing theme development. I do want to point out that, you know, Atomic design is great and awesome, and it's a wonderful way to think about it, especially as we're going into block-based editing, but there are some limitations of Atomic design, both technical and philosophical. So I do want to bring those up just so that people can be aware. There's still some issues in CSS with styling elements. Ideally, everything should be contextless, but elements are still often styled relative to the page rather than to their parent. We can't really style a CSS element relative to its own parent yet. We're still looking at, the viewport width or the width of a container or the width of it, right? So it's a CSS limitation. They're working on figuring out ways of being able to do parent container styling, but it's still something, it's not quite contextless yet. Another problem is if dry leads to DTM, so don't repeat yourself sometimes leads to one thing trying to do too much, DTM, so it can be reused more often. I've had this problem in my own block plugin where I'm trying to build like something that outputs a list of posts. And then I'm like, okay, well, what's a list of posts? Well, maybe I want to pick it from the whole post type. So like the most 3 recent posts, or maybe I want the 3 most recent from this category. Or maybe I want to be able to manually pick those posts. Or maybe I want to say more than 3. Or maybe I want to output a list of all the categories. Or maybe just some of the categories. Or maybe I want to view all, and then I just like it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger as I try to think of every single thing that a list of posts could do, right? So I understand that in trying not to repeat yourself and trying not to have too many specialized little things, you sometimes can end up with big giant things. So that's also a problem too. There's also, I did try to explain molecules, organisms, all these other things. It's not necessarily easy to be able to tell what the difference is, like which is which, especially stuff with utilities or helper classes. Like what is that constituted? Like what is, this mixin supposed to be, right? So there's a little bit of ambiguity. I think if you're building your own themes for clients and you get to control all the naming conventions, like it's not that big of a deal. If you're working on a bigger team and you're trying to develop a system for doing all this stuff, it gets a little weird, but you'll probably just have to have some conversations about that. Also, the prescriptive versus descriptive systems. So this is not a flaw in atomic design specifically, but basically in all design systems. And this is the thing that people kind of reference when they say that design systems are very they make design boring, they make design robotic. A prescriptive design system is basically following a top-down design from above rule book. So this is like, here are all of the rules, these are the only things you can do, and from here on out, all you're doing is executing on these rules, and there's nothing exciting about that. That can be, a little bit stifling of creativity. A descriptive design system is one where you are documenting how design is being used, more as an observation, more as a guideline than actual rules, right? If you want to. See, it's funnier when there's people around me that can laugh at my jokes, but instead I have to laugh at my own jokes. So that's like the one downside of. See, the other people in Zoom are laughing at my jokes. They think I'm funny. That's good. Thank you, other organizers. You're validating me. So descriptive systems are more about documenting the way design is being used as opposed to like an authoritative, here's how you absolutely have to use design. Using a descriptive system to talk about your design process is maybe a little bit more creative than the other one. I do want to go through a set of resources that you can have available. Again, I don't expect you to write any of this down right now because it's just going to be a whole bunch of links. You will have all of these things available later to download. First of all, I have provided a list of resources here about all the different concepts that I've talked about and also some different tools that you can use to play around with that stuff. I want to call out the ish variable viewport tool. It's literally just a thing where you can take a website and it'll give you like a mobile-ish size or like a tablet-ish size because there's no such thing as one size. If you put it in disco mode, that's super fun. Try it out. I have a whole bunch of articles here about modular design specifically. Again, I don't expect you to write them all down right now, but if you're like me and you like to read a bunch of articles while eating brunch on a Sunday morning, this is a great list for you to enjoy over your eggs or waffles. And several articles here also that have come out recently about the future of themes, especially as it relates to the block editor, full site editing, and all the things going forward. Again, these are all available in the link that I'm about to share with you. But I wanted to get the final slide up. This is me. This is where you find me, my email, me on Twitter, me everywhere. That link is the important one. That is the link to where the slides are at, the bit.ly link. Otherwise, I'm all over the place. You can find me now in Slack and in the various chats, both for WordCamp and in the general WordPress Slack. Online, I There's my website. I also run a blog called Fitness and Freelance. My DMs are open on Twitter. I am helping to organize WordCamp Minneapolis St. Paul in August, and in person someday again. We will see each other in person. Until then, I'm here. So I'm open for questions if there are any.
That was awesome, Michelle. And I just want to say, like, people in the chat were laughing. They thought your joke was funny. So at least you get that validation as well. But there was quite a bit of interaction talking about the future of themes. And I know that you touched on that a little bit. But one of the questions was, like, is theme development in the future going to be dependent on using Gutenberg and the block editor? Like, we know that there are page builder plugins that have done this in the past. What does that look like going forward now that there's a block editor in core WordPress?
Sure. I think all theme development is going to be about supporting the block editor, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all theme development is going to be about thinking about block specifically. If we are styling, so I gave a workshop at WordCamp US that was a little bit more in depth about this. But if you, as a theme author, are styling for atoms and molecules really well, the HTML elements like outside of blocks, then almost any block that comes in will adopt your theme styles, unless that block is super opinionated and comes with a million of its own styles, and that's an entirely different conversation. But if you are styling for all of the core HTML elements really well, if you are styling for all of the core WordPress classes really well, any block that comes in should still feel like it makes sense within your theme, right? And so I believe that's the responsibility that theme authors are going to have. And it'll hopefully be the responsibility of plugin authors to be able to let themes override their CSS. There's some plugins that do that fairly well. I hope everyone else does that. That's the way, like, sure, give us some opinionated CSS if we just want to plug it and play it, but give us an ability to override it if our theme has put some thought into it, right? But yes, I do believe that much like, I don't know, much like any other thing that's gone into WordPress, like, we are going to have to design for those features. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. There was another question too about how things have become very similar and like how they're laid out. That Nick says, like, a lot of sites look alike. There's a header, a nav bar, there's a hero image with 3 to 5 cards and images. Like, how do you bring in unique layouts into that? And there was some conversation in the chat about how some of that's for usability, but I'm curious on what other thoughts that you have there.
Sure. I mean, actually, I think the cool thing about the block editor is that any given page can be a totally different experience, pretty much, you know, if we want it to, especially as we go into full site editing, that could get really exciting because, you know, if we can change our headers and footers and everything on a page-by-page basis to service what that page needs, that could be cool. That being said, as a user experience professional, I believe in the power of patterns, and I believe in the concepts illustrated in the book Don't Make Me Think, which is a great resource if you want to learn about user experience. We have patterns for a reason. It's good to use them if we don't have a reason to not use them. So the way I kind of think about it is this: like, if we are designing for an audience that we know wants to push those boundaries, like if I'm designing a site for other designers, right, I'm going to design a very different site than a site that I'm going to design to try to sell used cars, right? Because the outcome is very different. Like, if I'm designing a site to showcase my creative work, it's very different than a site where I want someone to buy something. I think the more transactional a site is, the more we want to take advantage of patterns because we want to get out of the end user's way and let them do what they came there to do, right? We don't want to have them try to figure out how clever we are. But I think there's a lot of room for being clever and being creative and being awesome also. It's just a matter of like, is this the right context for it? And is our audience going to be able to follow it?
Great, thank you. That was a great session. There were still some more questions coming in, and I know that we're running out of time. One of the things I wanted to mention is that some people were having trouble with getting the resource URLs. I don't know if you could just drop into the Slack channel and leave like the links so they can copy and paste. That might be helpful.
Yeah, I can do that.
And also, anyone who has any questions, you can ask in Slack. You can also reach out to Michelle. And for feedback on this session, there's a page on the WordCamp Hint website where you can leave information on Swent. And feel free to check out our sponsor booths. And we'll see you in the next session. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thank you.